Sutherland disappeared after she went for a jog last Wednesday, not far from her home. A massive search with community members would follow. Then 2 days later, on Friday, authorities discovered her body.
Our Claire Kreitz speaking with some longtime family friends.
House in fear. She didn't rush. She didn't text anyone that something felt wrong. It was the middle of the afternoon when she stepped outside in Jackson County, Arkansas. The kind of time of day when people are driving home from work, when doors are open, when life is still moving. She was wearing what she always wore to run. Shoes tied, phone with her. A simple routine she had done many times before. There was no dramatic goodbye. No one stood at the door watching her go. To everyone who knew her, this was just Sydney heading out to do what she always did. She planned to be back. Somewhere along that stretch of rural road, wide enough for cars, quiet enough for joggers, that plan ended. At first, nobody noticed. Minutes passed, then more. When Sydney didn't return, concern slowly replaced routine. A phone call went unanswered. Then another. The space where she should have been started to feel wrong. This wasn't someone who disappeared without telling anyone. This wasn't a woman who left her life behind. Sydney had people waiting for her. A family that knew her habits, co-workers who expected her the next day, a future that was already in motion. And yet, on that road, she vanished. No crash. No call for help. No witness stepping forward to say what they saw. Just a young nurse who went out for a run and didn't come home. Tell us where you're watching from. Because this didn't happen in some far-off place. It happened in a quiet community, on a road that looked ordinary, in the middle of a normal day. Somewhere between the moment Sydney left her house and the moment her absence was noticed, something happened that changed everything. Someone crossed her path. And whatever took place out there was powerful enough to make a healthy, strong woman disappear without a trace. In daylight, in a place where people thought nothing like this could ever happen. So what actually happened on that road? If you would like to keep being updated on true crimes, please click the subscribe button. Sydney Claire Sutherland wasn't known as the jogger or the missing woman in the place she came from. In Grubbs, Arkansas, she was known as someone people smiled when they talked about. Not because she tried to be the center of attention, but because being around her made things feel lighter. She was the youngest of 3 children, growing up on her family's farm with 2 older brothers who had watched her go from a little girl chasing after them to a young woman building a life of her own. Her parents, Dion and Maggie Sutherland, raised their children with structure and values that revolved around family, faith, and showing up for one another. In a town like Grubbs, that matters. People know who you are, who your parents are, where you come from. Sydney didn't need to introduce herself to most people. They already knew her face, her laugh, and the way she carried herself. At Tuckerman High School, Sydney wasn't invisible. She was involved. She joined clubs not because she had to, but because she liked being part of things. Spanish Club, Beta Club, Key Club, all of them reflected the same part of her personality. She liked learning, she liked helping, and she liked being around people. On the softball field, she wasn't just another player. She earned the title of Outstanding Senior, something given to someone who stood out not just for skill, but for attitude and leadership. People who went to school with her didn't describe her as someone who kept to herself. They talked about how easy she was to approach, how she made others feel welcome. Even years later, when she had moved on to nursing school and adult responsibilities, those early impressions stuck. Sydney was the kind of person who remembered faces and made you feel like you mattered. That sense of connection carried over into her family life. She was close to her brothers, Tyler and Sam, both of whom had their own families by the time Sydney was in her mid-20s. She loved being an aunt. Mila and Leanie weren't just her nieces, they were a source of joy for her. She teased them, spoiled them, and took pride in being the aunt who showed up, the one they would run toward when she walked into a room. Sydney didn't have children of her own, but she had a life filled with people who needed her and loved her. Her parents were still a central part of her world. She didn't drift far from home. Even as she became an adult with her own schedule and responsibilities, she stayed rooted in the place that raised her. Her faith was also part of that grounding. She attended the Grubbs Church of Christ, not as a formality, but as part of her weekly rhythm. In small communities, church isn't just about worship. It's where people check on one another, where news travels, where support shows up when things fall apart. Sydney belonged there. She wasn't just a name on a roll. She was someone people recognized, someone whose absence would be noticed. Her relationship with her boyfriend, Alex Nicholson, was another important piece of her life. He wasn't described as someone on the outside of her world. He was listed alongside her family, which speaks volumes about how close they were. Sydney wasn't living in isolation. She wasn't drifting. She was building something with the people around her. And then there was the side of Sydney that came out when she wasn't working or with family. She loved exercise. Running wasn't something she did out of obligation. It was part of how she cleared her head, how she stayed healthy, how she made space for herself. She listened to audiobooks, shopped when she had the chance, and spent time with dogs because being around them made her happy. These weren't dramatic hobbies. They were ordinary. That's what made them meaningful. They were the details of a real life. Sydney had plans, not necessarily written out in a 5-year outline, but present in the way she kept moving forward. She had chosen a profession that required commitment. She had people who counted on her. She had a routine that gave her stability. Nothing about her life suggested that she was about to disappear. And that's what makes what happened next so hard to process. Sydney didn't choose nursing by accident. It fit her in a way that was obvious to anyone who knew her. She had always been someone who noticed when others were uncomfortable, when someone needed help, when a room felt off. In a small town, people remember things like that. They remember who steps in and who steps away. Sydney was the one who stepped in. After high school, she stayed close to home, enrolling at Arkansas State University, Newport. She wasn't chasing a glamorous career or trying to get far away. She wanted something that mattered, something she could build where she already belonged. By July of 2018, she had earned her LPN license. For a lot of people, that would have been enough. It was a real job with real responsibility. But for Sydney, it was just the beginning. She kept going. While working, she continued her education, pushing through the long hours and the pressure that comes with healthcare training. In December of 2019, she graduated from the University of Arkansas Community College at Batesville as a registered nurse. That step mattered to her. It meant more responsibility, more trust, and more ability to care for the people who came through her doors. She worked at Unity Health Harris Medical Center in Newport, first as an LPN and then as an RN. It wasn't a massive hospital in a big city. It was the kind of place where patients and staff knew each other, where faces were familiar, and where your reputation followed you. Sydney's reputation was solid. Coworkers trusted her. Patients felt safe with her. When people were sick, scared, or in pain, she was someone they were glad to see walk into the room. Nursing takes something from you. It's not just technical skill, it's emotional energy. You absorb other people's fear and stress day after day. You see people at their most vulnerable. Sydney handled that without becoming distant. She didn't harden herself to get through it. She stayed open. That was part of why people connected with her. Her senior quote from high school said it plainly: "The meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away." That wasn't just something she wrote to sound thoughtful. It matched how she lived. She found what she was good at, and she used it to serve other people. Outside the hospital, she didn't live a reckless or chaotic life. She went to work. She came home. She ran. She listened to books. She spent time with family. She laughed. She rested. It was a steady, grounded routine. The kind of life that doesn't usually end up in headlines. Her running was part of that balance. It wasn't about training for races or posting times online. It was about staying healthy and having a space where she could think, breathe, and move. The roads near Newport were familiar to her. She had driven them, run them, lived around them. They weren't unknown. They were part of her world. Sydney didn't go out looking for danger. She didn't put herself in risky situations. She wasn't someone who lived on the edge. She was a nurse, a daughter, a sister, an aunt, a girlfriend. She had a job that demanded responsibility and a life that revolved around people who cared about her. That's why the silence that followed her afternoon run was so alarming. Because when someone like Sydney doesn't come back, everyone notices. And they know something is wrong. This is True Crime Chronicles. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to get more crime news. On August 19, 2020, there was nothing about Sydney's day that marked it as different from the many that came before. She went about her routine the way she always did. Work, home, rest, and then a run. Running wasn't an afterthought for her. It was something she made time for. It was how she stayed in shape, how she cleared her head after long shifts, how she kept herself grounded. That afternoon, she left her house wearing her running clothes, shoes tied, phone with her. There was no message sent to anyone that suggested concern. No one later reported that she seemed upset or distracted. To Sydney, this was just another run. The area where she ran was rural Jackson County, near Newport. Long stretches of road, open fields, and homes set back far enough that you could go a while without passing anyone. For someone who had lived there her whole life, it felt familiar, predictable, safe. She stepped out with the expectation that she would return. As time passed, the space she left behind started to feel wrong. Sydney wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without saying anything. She didn't abandon responsibilities. She didn't miss plans without explanation. When she didn't come back, it wasn't shrugged off as normal. Phone calls went unanswered, messages weren't returned, and slowly, the routine of that day gave way to worry. Her family knew her habits. They knew how long she usually ran. They knew when she should be home. When that window closed and she still hadn't returned, something felt off. The sense that something had interrupted her routine began to grow heavier with every minute. This wasn't someone who had just decided to keep going. This was someone who had been stopped. By the time authorities became involved, Sydney was no longer just a woman who was late getting home. She was a missing person. The road she had run on became the focus. That stretch of Jackson County was suddenly no longer just part of her daily life. It was the last place anyone knew she had been. Search efforts started quickly. In a rural area, that means people spreading out across fields, roads, and ditches. It means calling out a name into open space, hoping for a response. It means neighbors looking in places they've passed 100 times before, now with fear in their stomachs. Sydney's disappearance didn't stay local for long. News traveled. People in nearby towns began to hear about the young nurse who had gone out for a jog and not come back. The details were simple and terrifying. Healthy, responsible, in daylight, gone. The longer she was missing, the more serious it became. Adults don't vanish from their lives without a reason. Sydney had no history of walking away. She had too many ties, too many plans, too many people who expected her. Something had happened on that road. Someone had crossed her path. And whatever took place there was enough to remove her from the life she was living, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. When Sydney didn't come back, the space she left behind grew louder by the hour. In a town like Grubbs and the surrounding parts of Jackson County, people don't simply vanish without it being noticed. Her family knew something was wrong long before any official announcement was made. They knew her patterns. They knew her sense of responsibility. When her phone kept ringing without an answer, that familiar dread set in, the feeling that something had interrupted her day in a way she hadn't chosen. Law enforcement was contacted, and soon the area where Sydney had gone running became the center of attention. The road, the fields beside it, the places where someone might stumble, fall, or call out for help. All of it was checked. People who had driven through the area were asked if they had seen her. Anyone who had been nearby was suddenly trying to remember what they'd passed, who they'd noticed, what might have stood out. For the people who loved Sydney, the waiting was unbearable. Every minute that passed without a word from her made the situation feel heavier. She wasn't someone who took off. She wasn't someone who ignored her phone. The absence of even a small sign, a message, a voicemail, a single update, made it clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding. As the search continued, the story spread beyond her hometown. News outlets began reporting on the young nurse who had gone for a run and never returned. People who had never met her started paying attention because the situation was so easy to imagine. A jog, a road, a normal day, and then nothing. Search teams worked through the surrounding area. In a rural setting, that means wide spaces and long distances. It means trying to cover ground where there are no clear paths. It means hoping that if someone is hurt or trapped, they might still be alive and waiting for someone to find them. But as the hours turned into days, hope became harder to hold on to. There were no easy answers. No one came forward with a simple explanation. No one said they had helped her. No one could point to a clear moment where everything changed. For her family, this wasn't just a case. It was their daughter, their sister, their aunt, someone who was supposed to be home. They lived in that uncertainty, not knowing if she was injured, if she was being held somewhere, or if something far worse had already happened. The silence was the most frightening part, because silence meant that whatever had happened to Sydney on that road had cut her off from the people who were waiting for her. And while the search continued, one truth was already taking shape beneath the surface of it all. This wasn't a woman who had simply gotten lost. Someone had taken her. If you haven't already, subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles for more real stories, told with truth and respect. For days, Sydney's disappearance sat in that unbearable space between hope and fear. The search was still active. People were still looking, and her family was still waiting for some sign that she was alive somewhere, unable to reach out. But behind the scenes, the tone of the case was beginning to shift. Law enforcement no longer treated Sydney's absence as something that could be explained by a wrong turn or a delayed return. The lack of contact, the lack of any trace of her along her running route, and the way her personal routine had been interrupted all pointed to something else. This was no longer just a missing person. This was a crime. The moment that realization took hold changed everything. Information began to surface that placed a specific vehicle near the area around the time Sydney vanished. The stretch of road where she had last been seen was suddenly not just a place people searched. It was a location where something violent had occurred. Investigators were no longer only trying to find her. They were trying to understand who had crossed her path and what they had done. The focus narrowed. Attention turned to a man from Jonesboro named Quake Llewellyn. At first, he was just another person connected to the area. But as details were examined, his presence near the road where Sydney disappeared became impossible to ignore. What had once been a wide, desperate search now centered on a single timeline. The narrow window between the moment Sydney left her house and the moment she was no longer able to answer her phone. That window was where everything had gone wrong. The case took a darker turn when authorities determined that Sydney hadn't simply collapsed or been injured. Evidence showed that she had been struck and taken. The idea that she might have fallen or become lost was replaced by the reality that someone had interrupted her run in the most violent way possible. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was an attack. The man under scrutiny wasn't just someone who happened to be nearby. He was someone prosecutors believed had made direct contact with Sydney on that road. And what they began to uncover suggested that her disappearance was not a mystery of chance, but the result of deliberate harm. At that point, the fear that had hung over her family and community hardened into something worse. The knowledge that Sydney had not just been delayed. She had been taken. And whoever did it had been close enough and bold enough to do it in the middle of a normal day. That realization turned a search for a missing nurse into the start of a murder case, one that would soon expose exactly how her life had been taken from her. Once the investigation narrowed its focus, the picture of what had happened to Sydney began to come into view, and it was far more brutal than anyone had hoped. The road she had chosen for her run was no longer just a stretch of pavement through Jackson County. It became the place where her life was violently interrupted. According to the charges and later court proceedings, Sydney was struck by a truck. The impact alone would have been enough to leave her badly injured. She had not simply stopped running, she had been hit in the middle of a routine she had done countless times before. That moment on that road turned a normal afternoon into something she could not escape. But it didn't end there. The man prosecutors identified, Quake Llewellyn, didn't stop after the collision. Instead of calling for help, instead of leaving her where she was, He took control of the situation in the worst way possible. Sydney was abducted from the scene. Whatever chance she might have had to get help on that road was taken from her. Authorities later said she was sexually assaulted after being taken. The medical examiner would eventually report that her death was caused by multiple blunt force injuries. Those injuries told a story of violence that went far beyond a single strike. They showed that she had been subjected to a level of force that no one could mistake for an accident. Sydney's disappearance now had a horrifying explanation. She hadn't simply vanished. She had been attacked, taken, and killed. The fact that this happened in daylight, on a road she knew, made it even harder to accept. This wasn't some isolated, hidden place. This was part of her everyday world. The same roads she used to get to work. The same area she felt comfortable running through. Investigators followed the evidence back to Llewellyn. The details that tied him to the crime placed him in that narrow window of time when Sydney was last known to be alive. The sequence of events turned a missing person case into one of the most serious charges a person can face. Capital murder, rape, kidnapping. These weren't just words in a document. They were the legal names for what had been done to a young nurse who had simply gone out for a run. For Sydney's family, learning what had happened was devastating in a way that no search or uncertainty could have prepared them for. The hope that she might be found alive was replaced with the reality that her life had been taken in a violent, deliberate way. And for the community, the road where she had disappeared would never look the same. Because now they knew that what happened to Sydney was not a mystery of fate. It was the result of someone's actions. Actions that would soon be brought before a court. As the focus of the case centered on Quake Llewellyn, the tone of the investigation changed from searching to building a case. Law enforcement no longer needed to wonder whether a crime had taken place. The question now was how it had happened and how to hold the person responsible accountable for it. Llewellyn was from Jonesboro, not far from where Sydney had been running. The connection between him and the stretch of road where she disappeared became one of the key elements of the case. What had first looked like an ordinary day had been intersected by someone who, according to prosecutors, made a series of decisions that led to Sydney's death. The charges that were announced reflected the seriousness of what authorities believed had taken place. He was charged with capital murder, rape, and kidnapping. Each charge described a different part of what Sydney had been put through. Together, they told the full story of how a run had turned into an abduction and then into a killing. Capital murder is not a charge that gets used lightly. It means the state believes the crime involved circumstances severe enough to warrant the highest level of punishment. In Sydney's case, it meant that her death was not only violent, but tied to other crimes that made it even more serious under the law. The rape charge spoke to the assault that occurred after she was taken. The kidnapping charge acknowledged that she was not simply struck and left. She was removed from the place where she might have been found or helped. Each element showed how her ability to get away or get assistance had been taken from her. For her family, the formal filing of charges was a moment that brought both relief and pain. Relief, because there was finally a name attached to what had happened. Pain, because those charges confirmed that Sydney had suffered in ways no one wanted to imagine. The legal process began moving forward. Evidence that had been gathered during the search and the early days of the investigation became part of a growing case file. Prosecutors worked to establish exactly what Llewellyn had done and why the charges were justified. This wasn't a situation where someone was accused without cause. The state had information that placed him in the right place at the right time and tied him directly to what had happened to Sydney. The quiet stretch of road where she had gone running was now part of a criminal case that would determine the rest of his life. As the reality of what had happened became clearer, the community was forced to confront a hard truth. A woman they had known and cared about had not been lost to chance or misfortune. She had been targeted, taken, and killed. And the man accused of doing it was now facing the full weight of the justice system. As the case moved forward, the weight of the evidence against Quake Llewellyn became impossible to ignore. What had started as a desperate search for a missing nurse had become one of the most serious criminal cases in Jackson County. The charges he faced carried the possibility of the harshest punishment under the law. In October 2021, Llewellyn made a decision that ended the need for a trial. He pleaded guilty to capital murder and rape. By doing so, he accepted responsibility for what had been done to Sydney Sutherland. There would be no jury weighing evidence, no drawn-out courtroom battle over what happened on that road. The facts of the case, as prosecutors had laid them out, were no longer being disputed. The guilty plea brought the legal process to a close in one sense, but it did not bring closure to the people who loved Sydney. No admission, no sentence, could undo what had been taken from them. Still, the plea ensured that Llewellyn would never walk free again. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That meant exactly what it sounds like. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of release. The death penalty, which had been on the table because of the nature of the charges, was taken off the table as part of the plea. In exchange, the certainty of his permanent imprisonment was locked in. For Sydney's family, that sentence was the only form of justice that could still be given. It didn't restore her life. It didn't bring back the future she was supposed to have. But it meant that the person who took her from them would not have another chance to do the same to anyone else. The legal process had been cold and procedural, filled with terms and filings and hearings. But at its center was something painfully human. A young woman who had gone out for a run and never returned, and the man who was now being held accountable for ending her life. With the guilty plea, the courtroom chapter of Sydney's story came to an end. But the impact of what happened to her was only just beginning to be understood by those left behind. Sydney Sutherland's story forces people to confront a truth that is uncomfortable but important. Even the most ordinary routines can be interrupted by someone else's violence. She did not make a reckless choice. She did not place herself in danger. She went for a run in the same area she had always used, in the middle of the day, in a community she knew. That matters because it removes the false idea that tragedy only happens when someone does something wrong. The responsibility for what happened to Sydney belongs to one person, the man who attacked her. Placing that responsibility anywhere else shifts focus away from the harm that was chosen. But acknowledging that does not mean we ignore the reality that people still have to move through the world in ways that protect them as much as possible. This case shows how quickly an ordinary day can change. Sydney left her house expecting to return. Her family expected to hear from her. Her co-workers expected to see her again. When none of that happened, it wasn't because she had disappeared from her own life. It was because someone took control of it. There is a difference between awareness and fear. Awareness means understanding that risk can exist even in familiar places. It means recognizing that routines, while comforting, can also be predictable. That doesn't mean people should stop living their lives, but it does mean that sharing location with someone trusted, changing routes from time to time, or running with others when possible can make a real difference in how quickly help can arrive if something goes wrong. Sydney's case also highlights how important rapid response can be. When someone who is normally reliable suddenly cannot be reached, it should never be brushed aside. The sooner concern turns into action, the better the chance of intervention. In her case, the search began because the people who loved her knew something was wrong. On a broader level, this story reminds communities that safety is not just a personal issue. Roads, lighting, visibility, and communication systems all play a role in how quickly people can get help. Rural areas often lack the infrastructure that makes it easier to spot trouble or reach someone in danger. Improving those conditions is part of preventing tragedies like this. Most of all, Sydney's story reminds us that behind every true crime case is a real person with a real life. She wasn't a symbol or a headline. She was a nurse who spent her days caring for others, a daughter who stayed close to home, an aunt who loved her nieces, and a woman who had plans she never got to finish. Remembering her means more than knowing what happened. It means understanding what was lost, and why it matters that we keep telling these stories with honesty and respect. There was nothing unusual about the way Sydney left her house that afternoon. No hesitation, no warning, no sense that it would be the last time anyone saw her step out the door. She put on her running shoes, took her phone, and went out to do something she had done many times before, a short stretch of time just for herself, before returning to the life she was building. That's what makes this story so hard to sit with, because Sydney didn't walk into danger. Danger crossed her path. On that rural road in Jackson County, her routine was interrupted by someone who decided her life did not matter. A woman who spent her days caring for people at a hospital was met with a level of violence she never should have faced. A daughter who stayed close to home never made it back. When the legal process ended, the world moved on. But the people who loved Sydney didn't. Her parents still wake up without their daughter. Her brothers still carry the weight of losing the youngest one. Mila and Leanie will grow up with memories of their aunt that will never be added to. The future Sydney was supposed to have, the patients she would have helped, the moments she would have shared, all of it stopped on a road she trusted. The man who took her life will spend the rest of his days in prison. That is the closest thing to justice that exists now. But it does not fill the space she left behind. What remains is her story. Not just the way it ended, but the way it was lived, with kindness, responsibility, and a willingness to give to others. That part matters, because it reminds us that she was more than what happened to her. She was a real person whose life deserved to continue. If Sydney's story stayed with you, share it, because attention keeps people like her from being forgotten. And tell me, what moment in this case hit you the hardest? Your voice helps keep her memory alive.